In an unprecedented tragic event, the Mayak nuclear facility suffered a serious nuclear accident, resulting in a large-scale radiation leak and contamination of the surrounding area. This catastrophic event raised global concerns about the safety of nuclear energy and its potential repercussions. But before we start, I hope you subscribe to the channel and like it so I can continue with this content. What is in front of you is a nuclear station located in Russia, which was built to manufacture the nuclear bomb. But a major problem occurred in the nuclear tank in the station that caused it to explode, which caused one of the biggest nuclear disasters in history. The disaster that you will hear about was so terrifying that it remained secret and unannounced for 40 years. In order to know what exactly happened to cause this nuclear disaster, you will have to go back with me a few years ago. The story begins in 1945, specifically at the end of World War II. What happened was that America used a new force that no one had seen before, which was the 2 nuclear bombs that it dropped on Japan. This event was enough to end a world war the size of World War II and make America impose its control over the world. Here, other countries, especially the Soviet Union, began to see that this nuclear bomb threatened their lives. It is possible that America could drop a nuclear bomb on us at any time and end our existence. And indeed, they met. The Soviet Union leaders decided to see what to do about this disaster. And this meeting ended with the Soviet Union having to make a nuclear bomb as soon as possible and at any time. Here, the Soviet intelligence began a paradise of spies to work inside the American nuclear program and find out how this nuclear bomb was dealt with. The scientists in Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, began to work with all their energy to find out how to make the nuclear bomb. In fact, in 1946, the Soviet Union worked on a completely secret project whose purpose was to produce a nuclear bomb. This project, called Mayak, was a nuclear facility, and its goal at the beginning was to produce plutonium. And plutonium is the basic element for making our nuclear bomb. At the beginning, the Soviet scientists began to face very big problems and difficulties. This nuclear technology was something new at the time, and no one had worked on it before. They only had very simple information that they took from their spy network in America. But in the end, their Mayak nuclear project succeeded in producing the first batch of plutonium, despite the huge human and material cost that the Soviets spent it on the Mayak nuclear project. But there were almost no safety and security standards. Imagine that the radioactive waste had no place. It was dumped in the nearby lakes and rivers. Even when they realized the disaster of what they were doing, and the radioactive things that were dumped in the rivers, they made tanks, whatever, to throw their radioactive waste in. But leave all that and tell me about the cooling system in these tanks. The cooling system is the most important thing, because as long as tanks that contain nuclear and radioactive materials must have a respectable cooling system so as not to cause a nuclear disaster. I would like to tell you that the cooling system in these tanks was very low and unreliable. That is why the Soviet Union was a few years away from one of the biggest nuclear disasters in history. The Mayak nuclear facility had 20 tanks made of metal to store the most dangerous materials on Earth, radioactive waste and nuclear waste. When this radioactive waste comes out of nuclear reactors, its temperature reaches from 400 to 1000 degrees. 1000 degrees of resistance are contained inside a tank that touches the timed bomb that could explode at any time. That is why, as I told you, these tanks have a cooling system so that the temperature of the radioactive waste drops to very low degree. Unfortunately, due to negligence in some safety procedure, the cooling systems were not maintained until the cooling systems began to wear out. These cooling systems, I'm sorry, do not cool the battery. This car cool things coming out of the nuclear reactor, things that were supposed to be put inside a nuclear bomb. And the problem is that the engineers inside the nuclear facility knew about this, and the temperature inside the tanks was exceeding 150 degrees of strength, and no one was talking. And actually, when the year 1957 came, specifically in September, the cooling system in nuclear reactor number 114 went out of service. And here, you have to stand up and worry, because you will start dealing with something that will not only take you out of service in this nuclear station, it will take you out of service in the world. And wow, if the cooling system in the other tanks does not make it. Okay, now that the cooling system has stopped, this means that the alarm bell will start ringing in the control room. And at that time, specialized engineers will come down to fix the cooling system and resolve the issue. But did this really happen? Let's know that the engineers, after they knew that there was a cooling system, did not consider it a priority and thought that the tank, because it was made of metal, could withstand the condition. Indeed, the tank was able to withstand the temperature of the radioactive waste, which continued to increase gradually for days and months. But the time came inside tank number 14, and the waste containing the nuclear remains began to reach catastrophic temperatures, and the metal walls of the tank began to crack and show cracks. Indeed, when September 29th, 1957, and specifically at 1:45 after midnight, the control room in the nuclear facility began to see strange things. The temperature gauges began to jump to astronomical numbers, and the pressure on the walls of the nuclear waste tank was very clear. Here, the scientists working in the nuclear facility began to see that something abnormal was happening, and the news reached the ranks of the Soviet army. But the orders were strict regarding secrecy and prevented the scientists from taking any quick action. During this period, all those working in the nuclear station were working in silence and complete terror. They all knew that a disaster could happen at any time, and they even began to feel they are noisy, and some complained of skin irritation. And all the Arabs say that the tank can no longer bear it and started to squeak with radiation. But the official explanations that were coming out were that what was happening to the workers who were working in the nuclear plant, it is just a simple fatigue due to the exhausting work. And indeed, as I told you, on September 29th, 1957, and specifically after midnight, tank number 14 exploded in the Mayak nuclear plant. The tank exploded with an explosive force equivalent to 30,000 kilograms of TNT, classified as a highly destructive material with a terrifying explosion. The tank, which was made of steel, was completely destroyed, leaving a crater with a volume of 3,000 cubic meters, 4 floors underground. Now, the Soviet Union is supposed to declare a state of nuclear emergency so that people living near the nuclear plant start walking away. But unfortunately, the Soviet Union remained in the dark about the explosion, and anyone who spoke would be detained. Indeed, the radiation that came out of the nuclear tank began to rise for tens of kilometers to cover the globe and the evacuated cities, and plants began to die, and animals fell to the ground dead, and people guessed and did not hesitate. 270,000 people were victims of the radiation that came out of the nuclear explosion. So where is the Soviet government in what is happening? Where, when they moved to evacuate the areas surrounding the nuclear plant and began evacuating tens of thousands of people who were close to the Mayak nuclear plant, and the people who were leaving their homes did not know what was happening. The government did not explain anything to them or tell them about the danger they were exposed to, as if everything had to remain secret even if it cost people's lives at that time. The only goal of the government was to control the disaster and prevent the spread of news, regardless of the disasters that would happen to people or the environment. The important thing is that experts came to assess the extent of the disaster and know how to collect. Indeed, when they knew the catastrophic problems that the environment was exposed to. 38,500 individuals participated to cleanse the area of radiation. Over the course of 24 months, they were able to point out the crops, lands, fruits, and anything that was exposed to radiation. This was, of course, so that they could begin to limit the nuclear disaster. The Russian government even kept the details of this disaster in top secret files for 40 years. 40 years, people were surprised as they could not bear children like the first. And even the first children who they were born with deformity, and people were dying from disease that suddenly spread and no one knew the cause, except of course the Russian government and the Soviet Union until 1997, and the files of this disaster were declassified and it was actually announced as the Kashtam nuclear disaster. Do you want to know that the Kashtam disaster was not just a nuclear tank explosion, but was a tragic study in complete human arrogance and neglect? The lives of the innocent who died and the deformities that affected the generations that came after that, and the areas that were transformed into radioactive graves were all a direct result of the secrecy and confidentiality that the government preferred over the lives of its people. We can consult on and say that it was the reason for the explosion of the nuclear tank at the Mayak nuclear station and the injury of this huge number of victims. I will wait for all your answers below in the comments, and I will respond to all of them. If you reach this far, I would like to say thank you